attendees are just coming in to our Zoom. And of course, hello to everyone joining us on Facebook as well. Do share the link of our webinar to all of your friends and family who would like to attend this afternoon. So today's webinar is 58 Years of Malaysia, Narratives of Nationhood. This webinar is part of a larger project that Ideas is currently undertaking on national unity and interracial harmony. And this webinar is, of course, part of our celebration for Malaysia Day this year. That was yesterday, and I hope some of you got some rest and got some patriotic celebrations in hand yesterday. So this afternoon, I will be your moderator, and we'll have welcoming remarks by Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al-Abidin, Ideas President, followed by opening remarks by His Excellency Michalis Rokas, who's the Ambassador and Head of the EU Delegation here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. We are also joined by 4 panelists, which I will introduce as we begin the webinar. Now, after this webinar at 5 p.m, roughly, we are releasing our our third video in our Sama-Sama series that we have been doing since the beginning of this year. So the topic for today's video will be, let me just check in. Kumpulan tertentu berhak mendapat hak istimewa. So today's video is going to be a conversation about affirmative action, about special rights, and I assure you it will be a very interesting one. So I do hope you tune into Ideas social media pages at the end of this webinar to view this video. All right, so to kick things off, I would like to welcome Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al-Abidin, Ibni Tuanku Mohriz, to just give some welcoming remarks for our webinar today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah. And Assalamu alaikum. Very good afternoon, Ambassador Rokas, distinguished panelists, colleagues at Ideas, and all the participants joining in online. And a very happy Malaysia Day for yesterday. Malaysians of my generation, we remember that it was a big deal when the 16th of September became a public holiday. And for many Malaysians in the peninsula, it was quite a revelation that it even ought to be a holiday. But since then, I think all of us have sort of normalized the idea that we have these two holidays within just 16 days of each other, 17 days of each other. Retailers love this Merdeka month idea that they can stretch out all the efforts covering both 31st August and 16th September. But despite that sort of normalization of the celebration, there are many things which remain misunderstood, unappreciated, the significance of historical dates and events, of course, the different cultures and traditions that span the South China Sea, and of course, the terms and expectation of the Malaysia Agreement. So today, Ideas is very fortunate to have this distinguished and very energetic speakers to discuss these narratives of nationhood. It's always been my belief that no one should have a monopoly in disseminating narratives of nationhood. It is part of a robust democracy that even the foundations of a country can be subject to scrutiny and debate. Having said that, I am obviously not one to advocate for violent revolution. The purpose of this inquiry, of this reevaluation, is to ensure that the institutions we've created and the agreements that we've signed continue to be relevant and continue to work well for current and future generations of Malaysians. Because if they're not perfect, we can reform them through the consent of the people according to the provisions of our constitution. And that's why Ideas organizes events like today's. I'd like to thank the European Union for supporting this event and our other efforts at Ideas. Questions of nationalism, regionalism, federalism, devolution, and their relation, of course, to sovereignty, democracy, and freedom are common all across Europe. And I'm very hopeful that we in Malaysia will be able to tackle these issues in a mature and deep and meaningful way as well. I'm glad that Ambassador Rokas, you're here and helping us to create that sort of intellectual structure and advance these platforms for the benefit of Malaysia and for Malaysians as well. So with that, I wish everyone a very happy and productive seminar, and I shall be listening in as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tunku Zain. Wise words, as always. Next, I would like to give a very, very warm welcome to His Excellency Michalis Rokas, who is the ambassador and head of the EU delegation here in Malaysia, to give us a few opening remarks before we begin our panel session. Please go ahead, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you for the warm words, Tunku Zain, His Royal Highness. We are always extremely pleased to be associated with ideas and support your events that always they bring great discussions and they are of the highest quality. Of course, warm welcome to all distinguished panelists and to our virtual participants. Yesterday, you said it, you have commemorated the 58th Hari Malaysia. Malaysia, of course, has come a long way in making the promises of 16 September 1963 a reality. And this is a reason indeed to celebrate and to be commended upon. Coming together in solidarity and unity is even more relevant in these trying times of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, of course, we all hope we would be able to contribute to this event and celebrate it next year's Hari Malaysia in more safely, more freely, and more open way. Of course, as I said in my intro, in the beginning, that I want to thank Ideas for organizing this webinar, because the narratives of a nationhood, it is something very, very pertinent. I imagine that the distinguished speakers will discuss the formation of Malaysia as a federation and the implications of this process for today's society and politics. But since you invited me to say a few words, I think I would like to tell you what we do in the EU and to focus on our integration process. Of course, it is a process with entirely different characteristics. But nevertheless, I want to use this opportunity to give you some concrete recent examples, today's examples of the EU commitment to thrive with our motto, which is united in diversity. A little bit of historical background. The formation of the European Union as we know it today has been a long journey. It dates back to 1951 when the European coal and steel community was set up with the aim of ending the catastrophic and bloody wars between neighbors. Thus, a process started that has gradually united European countries economically and politically in order to secure lasting peace and harmony among our societies. So the signature of the Treaty of Rome back in 1957 created our European family and laid the foundations of the modern European Union of today. That was 64 years ago. Today, there are 27 members in the European Union with 24 official languages. And it was not until the year 2000 where the motto, United in Diversity, became the motto of the European Union. And as we try to come closer together, however, we still face challenges. And we have to address them, especially in the very challenging context of today. Let me say a few words that are very recent by highlighting some messages that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, delivered for the annual State of the Union address before the European Parliament just 2 days ago on the 15th of September. She pointed out, and I quote, "The European Union is a union of equality. We are a union of member states with diverse societies. Diversity is part of who we are, our DNA. We can only be strong when all are included and everyone can thrive. This is what united in the diversity means. And I continue to quote, to achieve this goal, we are putting in place policies and measures that challenge structural discrimination and the stereotypes that are often omnipresent in our societies. This aims to create the conditions for everyone to live, thrive, and lead regardless of their sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion of belief, disability, or of sexual orientation. A union of equality is also there to ensure that the decision-making process takes into account the needs of everyone of all these societies, and that we will address intersectoral discrimination rights at the roots. So I can give a few recent examples of our ongoing efforts to make a union a true union of equality. The EU Anti-Racism Action Plan was adopted last year, 1 year ago, on the 18th of September 2020. It sets out a number of measures to tackle discrimination through working with member states, including law enforcement, national law enforcement, media, and the civil society. In March this year, we adopted a strategy on the rights of persons with disabilities, paving the way for a barrier-free Europe that will ensure people with disabilities can fully participate in society and in the economy on an equal basis with others in the EU and beyond. Gender equality has never been so high on the EU in the recent years. The goal is a union where women and men are free to pursue the chosen path of life, have equal opportunities to thrive, and can participate equally and lead our European society. To this end, the European Commission proposed earlier in March this year measures to ensure that women and men in the EU get equal pay for equal work. And to make Europe fit for the next generation of Europeans, we have to look at our children, and we put proposals for a new comprehensive strategy about their rights. The strategy entails measures across 6 thematic policies that they include participation in the democratic and political life from early stages, fighting child poverty and all forms of violence against children, strengthening child-friendly justice, supporting and protecting children through the digital transition. So the European Union experience suggests that the process towards what our president said or called a union of equality, as you see, it's a long journey that requires consistently renewed engagement. So now I will come back locally, and I want to conclude. I think we can draw a lot of lessons from each other. And here also my team is monitoring very closely and your efforts to achieve equality in Malaysia. And we have witnessed that you are moving in the right trajectory concerning inclusivity. We welcome the call by YB Minister Ahmad Faisal Al-Zamu to amend the existing Persons with Disability Act 2008 and to close the gap and providing more access to the disabled. We also commend the High Court's decision to grant equal rights for Malaysian mothers to automatically confer the citizenship to the children born overseas, a bold step towards gender equality. But with that in hand, and concluding, is that the European Union, we are not there only to support your webinars and your sessions, but we can also, when you identify an area where the experience that I just shared with you is of interest and you want to know the know-how, my team and I will be extremely happy to sit down and work out how we can support further initiatives towards the turn in Malaysia. So thank you very much for inviting me and for to open the session and share these thoughts with you. And I wish you all a very successful webinar.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Michalis Rokas, Ambassador and Head of the EU Delegation here in Malaysia. We thank you, of course, for your support, continuous support of ideas, civil society in Malaysia, and I really appreciate you also sharing the challenges and also the efforts in the European Union to further enhance the values of equality and also human rights within the EU. And I believe that Malaysia has a lot to also learn and also contribute in the same field. So thank you very much. We will now begin with our panel session. We will start with Dr. Amrita Malhi. So Dr. Amrita Malhi is the visiting fellow at Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. She is joining us from Canberra in Australia, so very happy to have her on board. Please go ahead, Dr. Amrita. You can share your screen as well. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. Let me start by, thanking my hosts at Ideas. So Tunku Zain, thanks for inviting me. Ambassador, nice to meet you. Thanks for your comments. And I actually don't have a screen to share. I haven't made any slides, so you're going to have to look at my face. Hope that's going to be all right. And let me start my talk basically by saying, look, I'm under no illusions about Malaysia Day this year. It's a complicated time to be celebrating Malaysia Day. The nation, let's be honest, is in a tough position. There is a serious health and economic toll being taken by COVID-19. And there's also a fair bit of, I guess, political disillusionment around, after some events, not just 2018, but 2015, when the 1MDB scandal began to break. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that there's, a certain amount of disillusionment, a certain amount of cynicism. And I know that some of that disillusionment is fueling a discussion about Sabah and Sarawak and what they're getting out of Malaysia since 1963. Now, there are other people on this panel who are more qualified than I am to speak on Sabah and Sarawak, so I'm going to let them do that. And what I'm going to talk about today is some developments on the Malaya side of the nation, the Semenanjung side, and some of the ferment that was transforming politics in the newly formed Malaysia of the 1960s, when there actually was a Malaysia Baru, a brand new nation trying to find its way in a turbulent region during the Cold War and all the experience of decolonization as well. So I'm going to take the opportunity to experiment a bit actually in this talk, and I'm interested in your feedback as I try to develop this idea a little further. What I'm going to try to do in this talk is draw a line connecting some of the discussion that's currently going on in Malaysia today with some of the discussion that was going on in the 1960s. And now the line that connects these two discussions is a little bit younger than the nation, but it's also been marking an important milestone birthday this year. It's its 50th anniversary. That line is the NEP, the National Economic Policy, the New Economic Policy, which is 50 years old today. So I'm going to start by talking you through two moments in time, and I'm going to attempt to connect them by going to the NEP. Now, the first moment was in July this year, when Kini TV, which is the online channel of Malaysia Kini, aired an interview with Dato' Amir Ali Maidin, who is both the managing director of the Maidin hypermarket chain and the vice president of the Malaysian Retail Association. Actually, he's also the president of the Bumiputra Retailers Organization, so triple role. Now, in the interview, Dato' Amir was almost in tears as he told his audience that, on the one hand, owing to the impact of pandemic control measures on the public, there is more theft than ever taking place in his stores. On the other hand, and for the same reason, also due to the impact of pandemic control measures, those shoplifters that he is finding are, contributing to the increase in theft in his stores are no longer stealing high-value items that they can sell, like speakers and televisions. Instead, they're stealing basic nutritional staples like fish and vegetables. And at the same time, what they're buying is actually more instant noodles than ever. So instant noodles, as we all know, are the cheapest of the cheap stomach fillers. Reflecting on this situation, Amir Ali Maidin said, "It's sad." He told the audience while practically sobbing that it's sad, to see shoplifters stealing such things instead of things that they can sell, on the kind of secondary market. So that's one moment. The second moment spans 5 years, 1966 to 1971. When the new Malaysian government, led until 1970 by Tunku Abdul Rahman and after that by Tun Abdul Razak, issued a sequence of 3 white papers. The first, published in 1966, reportedly alerted Malaysians to a decision taken by the Communist Party of Malaysia, with Malaysia by then, to initiate a new program of United Front militancy, including by agitating against the new Malaysia and its national language and education policies, as well as its support for the United States in the Vietnam War. Now, the government, of course, accused the CPM of pandering to, one, to Malaysian Chinese resistant, to speaking Malay, to integrating, and two, to Communist China in its opposition to the Vietnam War. The second white paper, published in 1968, referred again to the CPM and its apparent growth in membership and its number of bases in southern Thailand, where it had been pushed into in the 1950s during the emergency. It also had a new strategy of training new young recruits and cultivating, I quote, red revolutionary villages in rural areas. Now, they were going to, quote, intensify military training and tactics, among other aims, to use the countryside to encircle the cities, as the classic Maoist formulation puts it. As if to demonstrate their conviction, on the 17th of June 1968, communists ambushed a Malaysian security force convoy near the border town of Kro, now Bangkalan Hulu, in Perak, killing 17 policemen. Evidently, from Thailand, the ambushers had now moved to Malaysia, and in the government's view, the Malaysian government's view, this was definite evidence that the CPM was now on the path leading to armed revolution inside Malaysia. Now, in addition to the escalating potential for violence inside Malaysia, emanating from the CPM's new strategy, the range of issues that the CPM was agitating around and the degree to which they were influencing Malaysians in Malaysia appeared to also have grown by 1968. One aspect of this growth in influence was the CPM's emerging involvement in Malay-Muslim social and political affairs. It was no longer solely agitating around issues that could be isolated as Chinese. Rather, in addition to its other targets of political parties, labor unions, schools, and universities, the CPM had, according to the government, begun to focus on the issue of, quote, the exploitation of the Malay masses as part of its United Front strategy. Apparently, the CPM had begun to argue that communism and Islam share the same ideals and can, quote, harmonize in pursuit of a common goal, namely the liberation of Malaya from imperialist domination. They refused to call it Malaysia, right? So they were still calling it Malaya, but they were going to, pursue the liberation of Malaya from imperialist domination, and of course, in their formulation, the domination of UMNO. To help prosecute this argument, the CPM had set up new educational camps and party schools in the border area. Now, why am I raising this? Because this growing interest by the CPM in Malay-Muslim affairs was thought a very serious problem by the Malaysian government, which had, since 1963 and the formation of Malaysia, actually a more serious job than it might have expected in creating a post-colonial nation state out of disparate elements. By 1968, UMNO and the Alliance had already navigated Singapore's exit from the Federation in 1965, and it had also defended the nation from the Indonesian confrontasi or confrontation aimed essentially at causing Malaysia to fail, given its role as an anti-communist bulwark in Southeast Asia. At this point, the alliance government led by UMNO was also already facing competition from PAS, the Islamist party that in those days was actually rather left-wing in its orientation, especially under the leadership of Dr. Burhanuddin Al-Helmi, who it accused of sympathizing with Indonesia, who the government accused of sympathizing with Indonesia, and plotting to overthrow the Malaysian government in 1965. So they arrested him under the Internal Security Act and imprisoned him for a year. He ultimately died in 1969, and with his death, the left-wing influence in PAS diminished greatly. By 1971, I'm getting onto the third white paper here. 1971, the third white paper was published, and by this stage, the alliance government had also managed to survive not only the 1969 pogrom or race riot in Kuala Lumpur, which we all know about, but also the general election that preceded it, in which it lost its two-thirds majority for the first time. Now, this white paper was different. It was not so much about the threat, it was about the decisions the government had made to manage the threat. And it was clear about the government's decision-making around, quite a range of challenges to its authority, as I discussed. And I raised this and the CPM and the rural agitation and all that to point out that it was not only 1969 that shaped the government's thinking, as we often assume, but actually the 1960s was a time also of a lot of agitation around landlessness, land reform, opportunities for Malays as well as other Malaysians, jobs, eliminating foreign control of the economy, as well as things like confrontasi, which, had the potential to essentially, cause serious problems for the integrity of the nation. By this time, the Malaysian government had decided to implement, I quote, a twin movement of security measures on the one hand and economic development cum social integration on the other. These developments and integration measures were embedded in the Second Malaysia Plan, intended to, quote, accelerate investment and economic growth with national unity through prosperity as the objective. The government is determined, the foreword concluded, not to give the communists a chance to subvert the new Malaysia that we are building. Now, the Second Malaysia Plan, of course, is famous, and that's because it's remembered for being the one that set out the NEP, aimed at addressing poverty while also restructuring Malaysian society to correct economic imbalance, to reduce and eventually eliminate the identification of race with economic function. Critical to this effort was the modernization of rural life, while also growing the urban economy and creating a Malay commercial and industrial community. It would, as we now know, create a Malay Muslim middle class. It was quite essential to producing this outcome, producing the middle class in general. The 40-year or so growth of this middle class has actually been multiracial, and in the process of that, it has produced specifically a Malay Muslim middle class too. And in that production of growth and development and increased prosperity, the aim of the NEP was also to pursue a vision of national unity around a shared culture and language, and perhaps more importantly, a shared experience of rapid economic growth. The idea of rapid economic growth has been essential and central to the idea of social cohesion and national unity all the way since the Second Malaysia Plan. Through this growth and the economic restructuring that it would perform, as well as generating growth for everyone, the NEP would produce social cohesion. So in the rural economy, dominated by Malay Muslims at the time and possibly now, I mean, it's debatable, but anyway, in the rural economy, whose grievances it had argued the communists were exploiting, the Malaysian government rolled out a program of agricultural research, strengthening rural institutions, more irrigation, fertilizers, double cropping, intercropping, and a lot of hard and soft infrastructure like roads, telecommunications, electricity, hospitals, housing, institutions for... Hello?
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Amrita. Sorry about that.
As well as institutions for extending credit to smallholders and so on. So all these things were expanded. So on top of all of that, the East Coast, which was not growing as quickly as the West Coast, was going to be afforded extra attention. Now, through these initiatives and the many others that were set out in the plan and the NEP, the Malaysian government began to lay down the institutions of the developmentalist state that so significantly shape Malaysian public life today, with the aim of rapidly developing the nation to leave the grievances of the 1960s in the past. Now, the other aim, or the other outcome anyway, was to bind society to the state, especially that majority Malay Muslim segment of the population that could then onwards serve as a bulwark for UMNO and against attempts to move UMNO off the stage. As these white papers and the Second Malaysia Plan and the NEP demonstrate, Malaysian elites' efforts to transform the nation through accelerated development since the 1970s have been informed by the experience of the 1960s, namely as a period of acute danger to their authority and their position. Now, recognizing that the communist challenge was conceivable, and that in their words, it had always held the position, or the communists had always held the position that Malays as a community were a special target for communist subversion. So recognizing all of this, the Malaysian state has since invested heavily in anti-communist communications. Specifically, in the context of the Cold War, and you can hear its legacies now in politics now, it invested heavily in the concept that Islam and communism were diametrically opposed in concept and purpose, and any domestic political activity that can be labeled Chinese in the Malaysian context is frequently associated with communism in the public discourse, and of course with disloyalty to the party that is practically fused with the state. Now, let me get back to today. The reason I go through all of this is because the growth that the NEP delivered and the cushion that that growth provided to help protect Malaysians' resilience in the face of racial and religious rhetoric has stalled. It's no longer there. At the same time, if we look back to the campaigns based on racial and religious rhetoric that brought down the government elected in 2018, it is very likely that there are sections of the Malaysian political class that are learning all over again that anti-Chinese politics work. They are so effective that they can cause governments like Pakatan Harapan to topple themselves. They don't have to be toppled, they can topple themselves, driven by the fear of not being able to cope with the pressure that those campaigns create. And it is not wrong to learn the lesson that actually this works. Racial and religious politics, they really do work. On top of all of that, today there is a round of discussion now taking place about whether Malaysia's middle class, so famously built by the NEP, has actually collapsed. And there's a moment that I remember very clearly. I was watching on Astro, and it was Mahathir's former advisor, economics advisor, Khalid Mohammed, or Muhammad Khalid, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, he actually said, just blurted it out, look, the Malaysian middle class is already gone. It's already collapsed. Now that was a moment that I'm not going to forget, actually, because, given that this is now the state of the debate, if we think back to the experience of the 1960s and of the NEP, I mean, think about it, right? There's been an indelible imprint left that not only strong economic growth, but also strong pro-Malay Muslim economic restructuring are essential to protecting social cohesion in the Malaysian context. And so without that growth, where is that social cohesion going to come from? If the two things are inextricably linked in the minds of not only Malaysian governments, but also of many members of the community, I mean, I think it's an open question, right? What's going to happen next? So for me, the questions are very likely, how will Malaysia get that experience back? Where will the growth come from? Is it going to be possible to recreate that growth cushion that protects Malaysians' resilience in the face of racial and religious campaigning? Now, these are difficult questions, and they may require some honest discussions about anti-Chinese domestic politics, especially in an external environment that is increasingly shaped by China, but also by anti-Chinese competitive mobilization. So where now is the opportunity for discussions of unity? And where now is the opportunity for learning that lesson all over again, that anti-Chinese politics work? So is the future of Malaysian politics to be found in more anti-Chinese wedge campaigning, or can it become something more inclusive? I don't know the answer, so I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Amrita. That was brilliant. Such a sobering thought, right? Is the Malay middle class gone? Where will growth come from? So super important questions, and I look forward to questions from the audience as well, actually, a bit later on. So, but now I would like to welcome our second speaker, Badrul Hisham Ismail. He is the Director of Programs at Iman Research. So go ahead, Badrul, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ideas, and thank you, the organizer, for inviting me to this forum. It's good to be part of the panel.
Badrul, sorry,
yes?
did you turn on your camera? Because yes, there you go. Okay,
can you see me?
See you now. Yes.
Okay, so all right. So basically, I mean, we've all been saying that we reached an interesting milestone. Malaysia is now 58 years old. Yesterday, but there's also another milestone that I would like to sort of touch on today, which is last year we hit 77% of the country's population actually living in urban areas, which means that Malaysia has become majority an urbanized society. And this is sort of a rapid increase since a few decades ago, where we were just less than 50% urbanized. And just sort of to illustrate the rapid urbanization that has been happening in Malaysia, we can compare it to other countries. For example, in England, it took 79 years to move from 10% urbanized to 30% urbanized. In Japan, it took 66 years. In the US, it took 36 years. But in Malaysia, the same kind of change only took about 20 years to happen. So quite a rapid increase. And it's a figure that is expected to grow, not only because people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, but also the rural areas are becoming urbanized. And at the same time, we are continuing to have an increase of migration from outside of the country, people who are looking for economic opportunities, and also people running from conflicts and persecution. I think the World Economic Forum came out with a recent report, the annual report, says that Malaysia is still one of the top destinations for international migration. And with the current crisis that's going on in the neighboring country and neighboring region, for example in Myanmar or in Afghanistan recently, we are sort of expecting this number to grow, of course. And Malaysia is still one of the destinations for these people to look for a new place to stay. And the reason I want to touch on this is because becoming a more urbanized society means that we're becoming a more complex society, which first, of course, we can touch on our identities. We're becoming our identities and culture becoming even more fluid, even more overlapping, and talking about or promoting a very specific way of a national identity or national culture, the way we've been doing before, is becoming even more irrelevant. In fact, we've always been slightly cosmopolitan, and that's part of the tradition that we actually should try to reconnect with. But being an urbanized society also comes with more complicated issues, such as inequality, which is always more pronounced in urban areas. Disparity between the haves and the have-nots, is more visible. And even during this pandemic, you can see within the same locality, we have PPRs and worker dormitories, which was under EMCO, cordoned and barbed wire, whereas the neighboring suburbs and landed properties, they were not. People within the same neighborhood have people who have lost their jobs, who had to rely on food baskets, while the same people in the same neighborhood, different people in the same neighborhood can still enjoy work from home with uninterrupted income. They would have more money to from their savings to invest. People will start to invest in property, in gold, in bitcoins. So these happens within the same time, within the same sort of locality, which sort of illustrate the inequality and probably sort of touch on the idea that how our middle class is sort of gone now, like mentioned by Dr. Amrita just now. And another aspect, which is pretty much a very urbanized issue or a very urban issue, is that communal conflicts tend to happen in urban areas, in cities. Even our own history, we look at May 13th, the Kampung Medan incident, Lawyat Plaza incident, even the 3 years ago, the Seafield Temple incident, all happened in urban areas. And not to mention the daily sort of struggle that all the migrants and foreign migrants and refugee communities have to deal with, abuse of power by authorities, xenophobia from other citizens. These are all a daily occurrence in cities and in urban areas because we are constantly at each other's face, which we don't really have to deal with when we are living quite further apart in the rural areas. So we basically need to learn how to live near to each other without hurting each other. And touching about governance, a more urbanized society also needs a different way of governing. The current top-down, heavily centralized and hierarchical structure that we have now, basically where the federal dictates every single thing that happens all the way to the local level, needs to be drastically changed. We need to strengthen the capacity of local actors, both state and non-state actors. We see our experience in COVID, how the local communities have always been the first responder whenever everybody in the neighborhood are dealing with issues. We can look at the White Flag campaign, all done through local initiative. So we need to empower locals, both non-state and state actors, to be able to do more, to be able to contribute more, and not just wait for the directives from the federal government. We need a governance system that is more nimble and more agile and more flexible, because our needs change quite drastically from one day to the next. The needs of one locality differs from the needs from the other. So we need to do away with this sort of rigid, tight-fit policy approach that we've been having, or planning approach and practices as well. Instead, we should try to be more open, have policies that more open, more inclusive, that doesn't inhibit and doesn't exclude people, it doesn't suppress people, and open up to other different kinds of opportunities and possibilities, which has a lot to do with power redistribution And this again going back to our experience for the past year and a half, almost 2 years, during the pandemic and the sort of the political shenanigans that happened early last year. One thing that we can learn from it is you cannot rely everything entirely on the government, you know. And despite the recent political instability, where people, we have analysts saying that we have a weak government, we have a weak political coalition. Actually, our government has never been weak. It is always strong and have always been strong. Whatever they say happens. They want emergency, it happened. They want lockdown, it happened. No objections, no nothing. So we need to sort of change that kind of situation where we are always at the mercy of the federal government. Because there's always a disconnect between what is happening on the ground and what people talk and see. So we need to have some kind of a mechanism where there are more communication, there are more relationship, and more power for local actors, like I was saying earlier, to be able to decide on things and influence outcome rather than just following whatever directives that is getting from the top, which has been quite detrimental. People have to, people lose jobs because of this. You have to be away from the family because of this. So, and this is, not something that is going to end anytime soon, with future pandemic that we are anticipating and all that. So we need to be able to be flexible in terms of working within the spectrum of what we can decide on ourselves and what we need to rely on the authority, which goes to something that that was coined by an urban sociologist called Richard Sennett about being a competent urbanite, which basically means being an urban inhabitant that is capable of orienting themselves in the ambiguous and the complex urban system and urban environment. Many people, or city dwellers or urban dwellers, that can adapt to changes and the new challenges of life in the city, which is constantly changing and constantly new in terms of the challenges. And one thing about being a competent urbanite is we need to be able to know how to coexist with others that are different from us without relying on regulations, without relying on the authority saying you have to do this, you cannot do that. So we need to be able to do it ourselves, because not only we have to coexist, we also need to learn how to cooperate, to coordinate with each other. We need to be respectful and convivial while at the same time maintain our own privacy, because that's always something that is important. And most importantly, we need to be able to divert tension whenever it arises by ourselves without having the need of a strong hand getting involved in it. And these skills needs to be nurtured. We are not born with it. We need to learn from it. We need to learn to have it, and it needs to be nurtured. And examples from a lot of other places that we can learn from is we can learn it through having a public life, a healthy public life. But unfortunately, our cities, as it is now, and as it is being planned for the next near future, are not built to facilitate this kind of environment that can nurture that kind of healthy public life. Because it has to do a lot with our ability to be exposed to each other and to interact with each other in the public, on the streets, at schools, at the markets, and other public spaces. But unfortunately in Malaysia, our cities, which is, basically 77% of the country, are very car-centric. So people are confined in their personal space. The streets are empty. We don't even go to the same school. We don't even go to the same houses of worship. We're increasingly having gated communities, people excluded from knowing people who are not from their familiar background. We don't read the same newspapers, we don't read the same portals. And with COVID, we're even more isolated instead of being more together. So this is something that we really need to look into. And what's good is this, the past year, we had time to reflect on this, or we had time to reflect on this. And we need to reset on how we are looking at our public life. We need to relook at how we run our schools. We need to relook at how we develop our housing estates, our townships, our workspaces, our markets, so that we can create the kind of environment that would produce people who are able to coexist without overly relying on laws and regulation, which is something that is too top heavy and it's unsustainable. So I think that's all I would say for now. This is a time for us to sort of reimagine this new future that we can, by looking into these trends that is coming up and how we can sort of anticipate what are the things that we need to do and can prepare ourselves to navigate in the future, which is more important, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Badro. Yeah, that was really interesting, and some of the stuff that stood out actually from Badro's intervention was when you said that our government is perhaps not weak. In fact, it might actually be too strong all this while, and also the significance of space, right? When thinking about nationhood, when thinking about our relationship with each other. So that's really interesting, and I would like to actually come back to that during the Q&A. All right, so now we're on to our third panelist for today, Ms. Adila Zaki. She is the Public Relations Officer at Undi Sarawak. And I assume, or I think, who is the youngest panelist that we have today. So very glad to have you on board, Adila. I believe she's joining us from Kuching in Sarawak. So please, Adila, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ira. Okay, so give me a moment because I prepared slides. I might be over-prepared. I'm so sorry. I hope it gives you something to look at though. Give me
no worries, yeah, please.
Okay, so, all right. These are my slides that I created today. But before I begin, of course, good afternoon to everyone, to Yang Mak Mulia, Tuanku Zain Al-Abidin, His Excellency as well, esteemed panelists, and of course, the moderator juga, and everyone who is tuning in today post Malaysia Day. Before I begin, I would also like to thank Ideas Malaysia for giving me the floor, definitely, especially among all of these other people who are very much distinguished. And I hope that everyone who is tuning in for a bit, I would like to thank you in advance as well for lending me your ears for the next 15 minutes or so. As this Sarawakian youth comes in front of you to talk about how is it that, okay, a youth vote is an essential or really important tool when it comes to writing the narratives or writing the future of a Malaysia that they want. So let's begin. All right, so before we get into it, I prepared a little outline just so I thought it'd be easier for everyone to follow. And we'll start off with me explaining what Undi Sarawak is and what we do, mainly because that's the capacity that I was invited in. And I believe that it'd be great to have all of you understand the context and understand the efforts that we've been doing so far. Before I move on, of course, to number one, why is the youth vote important? I'm pretty sure that a lot of you are aware of it as well, and you know why, but allow me to reiterate from a Sarawakian youth perspective. Next, we look into, okay, so if it is very important and it's so essential in writing the future of Malaysia, then why are you not keen on voting? That's something to look into as well. And after that, of course, when you highlight an issue, you would want to come up with a proposed solution. So how do we get these youths to vote? And this will all end up with a little recap of the session. Okay. We'll start out first with Undi Sarawak. So who's Undi Sarawak? As you can see, we have a very nice logo over there. I quite like it. I personally like it. I didn't create it, but I like it nevertheless. Undi Sarawak is a campaign. It's powered by Undi 18. I believe that many of you are aware of what Undi 18 does. So we're under that as well. We are a group of youths, a really young bunch in my opinion, because some of our campaigners are as young as 16 years old, and I am in awe of them still until today. And yeah, we are youths. So expect us to be idealistic and a bit energetic as well. And our focus is on political and civic literacy. So we spread awareness, we put up educational content, we have workshops and webinars. And all of this is done in the Sarawakian context, meaning Sarawakian issues that would affect Sarawakians, be it youth, children, and so on and so forth. And that's basically who Undi Sarawak is, and I'm their public relations officer. Now we get on to the first question that I put forward in the beginning, is that Why is the youth vote important? I understand that many of you are aware of this already, but I'm looking into my camera right now because there might be someone who's watching this webinar who maybe after recent events, they want to start getting more involved. They want to know more. And maybe this webinar is their stepping stone. This is the first time they're getting to do something like this. I want to tell you that I hear you because I used to be in your position as well. So allow me to elucidate why is it that your vote is important. We know that there are plenty of ways that we could create change. You just look around and you can see everyone doing so much change. For instance, when we look at the Bendera Putih, how everyone starts working together, the selflessness, the generosity. When you go online, everyone pushing for all of these issues, for all of these causes. But another way, a primary way that you could create change, where you could directly help, write the narrative or the Malaysia that you want is through the vote. By choosing a representative that you know is pushing for the issues that you care about as a youth. In a democracy, we know it. The one with the most votes, they win. So obviously, fundamentally, that's what they do. They chase votes. And if we keep on this narrative where, okay, youth don't care, you don't want to vote, they don't see the reason to vote, then what is going to be their incentive to push for the issues that youth care about? Because we're not going to turn out and vote anyway. You have to change that narrative. You have to vote. You have to push forward for it, because imagine, okay, for instance, in Parliament, the median age is 55. The median age in Malaysia, 30. The difference is there. Yes, maybe they were a youth at one point of time. Maybe they're still young at heart. But they are not experiencing the issues that are affecting youth right now under these circumstances. They didn't have to go through online learning. They may not have to go through everything that we're going through as a youth right now because of the COVID pandemic. That's why it's so important for you to be heard through your vote. My glasses keep coming down, so sorry. But that is why your vote is so important. Okay, but now maybe some of you are wondering, if it is so important, then why aren't youth voting? And this is me, coming from me. I've never voted before because I'm 22. I didn't get the chance to vote yet. Back then, when it was the 2018 elections, I wasn't eligible to vote yet. I was 19. I'm glad that it's changing now, that is. So why are the youth not voting? I'm coming to you, coming from someone who I didn't get the exposure at school. The only thing that I knew was, okay, politics was a part of sejarah, but you need to read, okay, dari segi politik, apa dia punya kesan? That's it. But I didn't understand it. I didn't get it at home either, because my parents, my family didn't talk about politics. But I was lucky enough to have access to finding out more. And that's number one, actually. Why are the youth not voting, or why wouldn't they want to vote? The lack of exposure. There are some who, okay, they know politics tu ada, but they don't understand it. They can't make the connection yet. They don't see how does it affect them. Okay, so this person does this person is fighting each other, they're talking the blah, 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 they're not pushing for it. Okay, but how does it affect me though? They can't see it. Some of them don't see it. And can we blame them? When you don't learn it at school, and if your parents or your family doesn't talk about it, where do you get the exposure? Especially when you don't have access towards this abundant information. We need to understand that everyone has different circumstances. Not everyone has the same accessibility. To those who knew how to talk politics since they were primary school or since they're secondary school, that is wonderful. But we need to understand that there are peers of ours that don't have the same chance. And if they don't see how is it affecting them, they can't make the dots. And how are they going to know or understand the importance of their vote? They're not going to be able to understand the power that they hold when they go down and vote. Okay, contohnya, right? This is something that I saw as well. If someone had the chance, okay, a youth who probably, maybe someone who doesn't really know much for now, is that, okay, I have in front of me, a really good movie. That day is polling day, right? Really good movie. I have my Grab food right next to me. but I have to go poll and, cast my vote. So which one would I choose? Would I want to go cast my vote? I have to line up, I have to wait. If I can't make the connection and I don't see the importance of it, I'm just going to be like, never mind. You see? They don't see the importance of it. We need to show that, okay, it's not a waste of time, but in order for them to understand the importance, they need to see how it affects them first. And then it goes to this other question over here. It's like, how to vote? I'm 22. I had to learn things on my own, you see. I didn't see it when I was in secondary school. I wasn't exposed to this. And why is that so? Sometimes when they don't see the importance of it, is number one. And then when they realize how hard it is, they realize it's so hard to find out more about it, then maybe like, I don't want to do it lah. So this all goes down under like the lack of exposure, from not understanding how it affects them. And when they don't understand how it affects them, they don't understand the power that they hold. And maybe once they know the power that they hold, why is it so hard to facilitate them in that sense? Next one, we have apathy. I believe that a lot of people are feeling this at the moment. When you feel powerless, when you feel like, okay, even if I go down to vote, that's not going to make any difference. Everyone's the same, but don't feel that way. Do not allow those who do lip service, do not allow those who break promises to win just like that. You have the power, don't lose that. If you want to make a change, you're going to have to fight for it. And one of the ways is really through voting, because that brings power. The third one is, to some, they would think that, oh, I don't know enough to vote. I'm not ready. I guess, how can we blame them? I mean, that's what everyone's been telling them all this time, was it not? But they are. Who is to decide whether you know enough to vote? There's no little test. You don't need to read a particular grade in order for you to vote, because you have the right, and that is that. All votes are equal. But maybe what we can do, now we're going to look into how do we get more youth to vote, because I want to propose a solution to those people who may feel like they don't know enough, and for those who might feel like, okay, I'm really worried of making the wrong choice. There are plenty of ways, but this, for today, that is, I would like to focus on education, because I believe that's a stepping stone for everyone. Right now, we are no longer debating whether Undi 18 should be implemented or not, because it is going to be by the end of this year. Now we need to look into how are we going to make sure that once they're 18, they're going to go down and vote. Start in schools so that they're prepared to vote by 18 years old. You don't suddenly get all of this understanding about everything because you turn 18. Unlike the law, apparently. The law assumes that you know everything by 18, but that's another story. Start in schools. Children are ready for the conversation. And if you are unable to break down those complicated concepts into something simpler, into digestible bites, then maybe you would need to recheck yourself whether you know the subject well enough your own. So start in schools, get them prepared, civic education, so that they know what they're going to have to face, so that they don't have to go and look and swim through all of everything on their own just to find out how to exercise their fundamental right. Number 2 is accessible content. This is something that Undi Sarawak is really trying to do, where we create or curate content that is accessible by creating it in different languages. We have it in Sarawakian Malay, we have it also in Iban, so that we could, increase our outreach. So maybe moving forward, maybe towards coming to closer to elections, for instance, where, parties start giving out all of their promises and so on and so forth. Maybe one way we could aid new voters, because everything is new. Sometimes it gets really hard, politics gets really confusing, is that you could aid them into, okay, this is how you could make your choice. Next of that is that why is it so important for Sarawakian youth, or if from whichever state you're from, why is it so important for you to put in your vote? Why is it so important for you, and why is it considered you writing the narratives of the future Malaysia? Because you're coming from your locality, you're coming from your context, you know the issues that are affecting you right now. For instance, when it comes to social realities in, Sarawak. Recently, we had a little collaboration with Freedom Film Network and Civica Research, where we had a movie night. We played a few wonderful documentaries, and one of them included the story of Kam Agong, where it highlighted the issue when it comes to maternal health care in the rural areas of Sarawak. So maybe this is something that's unique to Sarawak. We have trouble there. And maybe your states have your own. So that's why it's so important for us to ensure that if these are issues that are happening in my state, I want to make sure that I choose somebody who is pushing for change when it comes to this issue, And at the same time, another thing why I liked about this little initiative is that we created a space for discourse. Many a times, I'm not sure whether you realize or not, like the more knowledgeable you are, the more arrogant you seem, the more you look at people who know less than you with an eye like, you don't even know this. How are you going to be able to make sure other people know more? Things are already hard enough for them to find out more. And when they want to go approach you, you give this impression that you don't know enough. What is wrong with you? This is your fault. We're supposed to be creating spaces for discourse, creating spaces where people can come forward with questions without judgment. If they are underinformed, then use your knowledge to teach them. Would you rather they walk away because they feel shameful and they're too scared to ask a question? Or do you want to help them so that they know more, so that they live with something new? So that's one of the ways, get used to vote, because sometimes when we start off, I was a little scared as well. But, platforms like Undi Sarawak, Undi 18, and when you meet with all these people who are willing to help you or willing to explain things to you without making you feel like you are not very smart, it really helps. I mean, that's why I'm here in front of you today. You don't need to look far on how do you want to get used to vote, or why you want to know how, why you don't understand why they need to vote. I'm in front of you. I am your target audience, and I'm coming forward with, these are some of the woes, you see. So just a little recap. I know that was a little bit all over the place, and I do sometimes get a little overboard sometimes, but that's just really how I am. Forgive me. But I hope that through the session, you could see, number one is that, understanding why the youth vote is so important, and understanding what is it that's causing maybe certain youths to shy away from voting or asking. And understanding what can you do now? If you are a youth, reach out. Don't forget how much power you hold. If you are a parent or a teacher, when you start these conversations, you are one of the first people who could expose them to this. And for everyone else who's knowledgeable, who know these issues, and there are people who might not really know, then reach out to them, educate them. You're supposed to come together, right? And don't look at them with a stinky eye. Things are already hard enough. Might as well educate the underinformed and make them understand. Okay? So we leave today with this one quote that I found. That is, to not underestimate the power of the ballot box. Because with that, you'll be surprised with how much of a better Malaysia you could come up with just by an X on a ballot box. Oh, ballot paper, sorry. So yeah, that's all from me. These are the contact details for Undi Sarawak. Just doing my responsibility as a public relations officer. You can take a picture of that if you like, and I will give it back to Ira. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adila. I feel so rejuvenated on this rather gloomy Friday evening with your presentation. Really, it was just such a brilliant presentation, and thank you for your call to action. I think that's really, really important. And I hope that we get some comments or questions from our audience for you as well. So now it's time for our last panelist, Dr. Arnold Puyok. He is the Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at University Malaysia, Sarawak. Dr. Arnold, you have the floor. So yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ira. Very good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this forum. Since we have a very limited time, I will go as quick as I can. I just want to share three main things related to the topic this afternoon, with the hope of generating more discussion, more debates about the future direction of our country and about the sort of narratives that we have to introduce now that we are celebrating the founding of Malaysia. So the first point that I want to make is we all know that Malaysia's politics has experienced a major shift or realignment since 2008, especially after BN lost its dominance. And in 2013, this was further reaffirmed after BN failed for the second time in maintaining its customary two-thirds majority in parliament. And BN's fall from power and the split in Malay support in Peninsular Malaysia meant that for the first time in our history, no single party could emerge as a dominant force to dictate the future direction of the country's politics. And what this means is that there is opportunity for us to go back to the drawing table and chart Malaysia's future political trajectories based on the spirit of the MS63 or Malaysian Agreement 1963 and the Federal Constitution. So for me, it looks like the politics of coalition building will be the order of the day in Malaysia's politics in the years to come. And we all should take this opportunity to be part of this process, no matter what political ideologies and principles we subscribe to. And the signing of the MOU between the current government and the PH recently shows that there is still hope for inclusive politics and political maturity in Malaysia. That's number one. Number two, with the weakening of the federal power, decision-making cannot be solely determined by the federal government alone, paving the way for Sabah and Sarawak especially to restore their rights based on MS63 and the Federal Constitution. So Sabah and Sarawak leaders therefore must be able to present their cases very, very clearly, particularly the rights that they want to be restored. Because Sabah and Sarawak leaders have always said that they want to restore their rights. Their rights have been eroded. But for me, what is important is to be clear or to be specific about the kind of rights that they want to be restored in the Federal Constitution. So for me, when it comes to the MS63, the devil is in the details. So it is important for Sabah and Sarawak to specify the provisions in the Federal Constitution that they want to be amended. And restoring the rights for the two states alone, for me, is not enough. So what needs to be done is a restructuring of the federation by way of decentralizing power to the state authorities. So the federation that we wish to create moving forward should be one that promotes diversity and safeguards the autonomy of the states based on their individual uniqueness. So the last point is regarding the way we look at the formation of Malaysia in 1963, and in particular the Malaysian Agreement 1963, because it is almost customary for us to look only at the perspective of Sabah and Sarawak when we talk about the formation of Malaysia in 1963, when in fact the federation was formed through the merging of three distinct territories, Malaya, Sabah and Sarawak. So MS63 should not be taught to the people in East Malaysia alone, but also to those in Peninsular Malaysia as well. Some people in Peninsular Malaysia perceive MS63 as the struggle to restore the rights of Sabah and Sarawak, when in fact MX63 is about strengthening the spirit of the Malaysian federalism. So I think today's forum is a good start for more dialogues on the new Malaysia that we hope to establish. Why I call this a new Malaysia is because I think this is a good start for everybody. As I mentioned earlier, now that our politics has realigned, there is no single dominant political power that can decide the future of the country. Everybody has to go back to the drawing board. Politicians from Sabah, Sarawak, from Peninsula Malaysia, we have to go to the drawing board and discuss the kind of Malaysia that we wish to see. So in our effort to do this, we must continue to strive for a Malaysia that belongs to all, whether you are from Peninsula Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. So I think with that last point, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Arnold. I think nice, short and sweet, and I think that gives us actually quite plenty of room for questions and comments from our audience today, which is what I will do. I will just look at the Q&A box first and take questions from there. There are also some questions from Facebook, which have been forwarded to me. I will try and group some questions together when possible. If not, then we will go through them one by one, since we have a lot of time anyway. So the first question in the Q&A box, I'll just read it out here, just for the benefit of all our audiences. So the first one is by from Hok and Koo. So his question, I think, is to Dr. Amrita. So he says, fascinating to hear your take on Malaysia's historical development, particularly how anti-Chinese politics can be so effective in bringing down multiracial coalitions. This is particularly of concern when Malay dependency on the government is at its all-time high. The financial aid given out by the government, for instance, to B40 Group is now at 90% Malay recipients of the total, not to speak of the government agencies and programs at effectively providing sustenance and lifelines to Malay businesses, and for employees, salaries from GLCs. The more this level of assistance is needed, the more anti-Chinese politics are needed. Whoever governs Malaysia has to deal with this reality. What is worse is anti-Chinese politics are largely based on fabrications rather than any real cause for this vilification on the ground. And I wonder if there is any way of this corner the country has painted itself into. So Dr. Amrita, I think you can take that one. Yeah.
Well, thanks. That's a hell of a question. It's a very complicated question to answer. And let me just try by starting out saying, you know, this is a time for government support. I have certainly no intention of deriding or arguing against social protection and cash payments in particular, especially in times of crisis like this. You know, given that you know, growth has gone completely backwards, given that there are people out of jobs, given that there are, you know, people looking for assistance via the white flag movement and so on, I think this is a time for it's a time for government payments. I suppose what I have been trying to highlight is that in the past, in the 70s anyway onwards, and during a particular moment in the Cold War, it was possible for a kind of a wedge to be created around addressing, you know, certain Malay Muslim grievances, and there were genuine grievances. You know, the issues of landlessness, issues of joblessness, I mean, these weren't just out of thin air. They were very serious issues, and they were a product of colonial rule. So the situation that the NEP was trying to address, and I must say, I'm not even upset about the NEP. I know you get a lot of people, especially non-Malays, who just absolutely hate the NEP. And I'm not really one of those, I must say. I really don't mind the aspirations of, you know, the peoples of Asia, right, to rise out of poverty. I really don't have any problem with this. And especially now that there's a situation where there is no automatic correlation between, you know, growth and kind of rising out of poverty at the moment. You know, it's certainly not a time for being upset with social payments. So having got that out of the way, I guess the question now is, this is not, it's possibly not going to be replicated. If it is, then okay, I think we've seen the blueprint. You know, I guess it's one option for the government is to replicate that wedge, you know, and try and kind of glue back together a Malay Muslim voting bloc. As Dr. Arnold said just now, right now there is no dominant party, there is no dominant group. It's an opportunity for doing things a different way. we know what the blueprint of the 70s looked like, and we know how long it has lasted, and we know that now it's in a moment of basically it's completely stalled. Are we going to go back to that, or is it time to actually negotiate a new settlement? So for me, it's not really that I don't really think anyone's to kind of blame for the situation. I'm not here to say UMNO did it, or Mahathir did it, or the NEP did it, or really anything like that. I just want to highlight that there was a certain moment in time and a certain resonance, I guess, between the domestic politics of the day and the regional Cold War geopolitics that allowed a certain response, and a certain potential for growth that allowed a certain response, and a certain marriage was orchestrated, right, between the idea of growth and the idea of cohesion. So now what are we going to do, right? And that's, completely open. Like Dr. Arnold said, it actually is quite open right now. And so there, I think, is where, Malaysia has an opportunity. I don't know if it will take the opportunity. That's very difficult to answer, especially as a historian. I have to historicize things. I can't make predictions about the future. I don't think really anybody can, and I don't think they should. But, I guess the question is, now it isn't so obvious what's going to happen. So maybe that is an opportunity, right?
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Amrita. Actually, there's a question on Facebook for you, which is quite related, actually. So I think I'll just read that out as well. So this person is asking, is the CPM relevant today? Is communism or socialism a threat to established government? Will the rise of China as a major economic and military power, and the fact of China becoming a major investor and lender to Malaysia, alter the racial dynamic in our politics? Very interesting question. Yeah.
Wow, the questions I'm getting are really not easy, right? But I suppose I've made my bed. I have to lie in it, right? By raising these issues. Look, I don't know if China's rise is going to bring communism back to the region, and I don't know if really there's much more mileage that can be made out of that, because really in the history of Malaysia, the importance of the communist theme is that it allows a political wedge to be inserted between Malaysian Chinese and Malay Muslims. And so in the context of there being no rise of China, that's not complicated, right? But now in the context of the rise of China, well, people got to know which Chinese you're talking about. Are you talking about the largest trading partner, or are you talking about somebody who might vote for the DAP? It gets complicated. And I just want to point to the Pakatan Harapan election campaign. So 2018, suddenly you had this opportunity for Pakatan to use Mahathir's political skills, basically. And what they did in that campaign was they subverted the whole theme of the Chinese threat. And they, instead of internalizing it to, your Chinese neighbors or people who might vote for the DAP or the DAP themselves, etc., they externalized it onto the People's Republic of China. So they pointed to the Chinese projects, they pointed to the ECRL, they pointed to Najib and 1MDB, and basically argued that the Chinese projects were to provide money to fill the hole created by 1MDB, and therefore, for the first time ever, it was possible to argue that UMNO was the national security risk, not the DAP, not your neighbors who might vote for them. And so that was so interesting, the way that was performed. Basically what they did is they said, okay, if Malaysian politics requires there to be a Chinese threat, we're going to provide you with one. It's just not going to be the usual one. It's going to be the external one. The very next day after winning the election, you saw Mahathir, making pretty much his first speech, basically saying, it's okay, that was then, this is now we're open for business. We don't mind where that business comes from. We're cool with China, no worries. Basically sending the signal that that was an election campaign. The campaign's over now, we've won government. Now we're going back to normal. And so, then there was this complicated period of renegotiating the contracts and all of that. But I mean, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that, when the largest trading partner is also Chinese in some way, and the biggest villains of the nation are also Chinese in some way, it becomes hard to make the argument. It becomes more complicated. And so there has to be a very deliberate decision to separate, which Chinese you're talking about. And I know that Malaysians are capable of holding that distinction in their heads, as they were in the 2018 election campaign. But I think the question is why? Like, why bother? What's the point of sticking with that mode of politics? And is there an opportunity to do something else?
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Amrita. Not an easy question to tackle. So really, really great answer. There's another one here, which I think might be good, maybe Badrul or even Adila. So the question is, do you see a trend where the governing narrative is changing from identity to something more fundamental like civil rights, economic inclusivity, fighting corruption? So basically the question is, is there this shift from identity to these substantive issues? Maybe Badrul, do you want to have a go at that?
Hi, thank you. I wouldn't say a shift, but there is a priority in terms of political campaigning to look into the issues of livelihood. And this is predominantly because of the struggles that we are dealing with in terms of the pandemic and the recovery. But there's also an interesting thing, which might be only anecdotal. I personally haven't really done really extensive observation on this. But issues on identity and racial politics went down after PH fell. It was really hyped up during PH time by their opponents. And the minute the government was back taken over by sort of the Malay coalition, it sort of died, it became not important anymore because basically the idea was we got back into power through that identity issue. And now the identity is no longer the issue. And then, of course, there's the pandemic that happened. The thing is, we always have to consider that the issues always come back again whenever there is a need to use it by whoever that is campaigning. So as of now, I wouldn't, which is why important for the people to realize whether we want that kind of trend to continue or not. Because as long as we don't show our own assertion that we want a different kind of politics that focuses more on governance, that focuses more on livelihood issue, that tackles issues such as the real important issue that we need to look into, inequality, environmental issue, which is something that we really need to talk about, but we haven't really been able to because we are still stuck in sort of identity politics. We need to be able to be the one who call the shots. Because in the end, politicians will just use whatever sentiment that we are showing, which is what I've noticed since forever. That's how politicians work. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Badrul. There are two questions here that I think, no, actually more than three questions that are directed to Dr. Arnold. So let me just kind of try and combine them into one. So there is a question on has recent events where East Malaysian, this in the Q&A box for Dr. Arnold, so by Kot Liang Chu. So has recent events where East Malaysian politicians have been playing the role of kingmakers helped to reduce the drumbeat for secession? I note that the issue of oil revenue is still very much alive, and that between 76 and 2017, Sarawak received $8.1 billion out of $162 billion in revenue. There's a second question, Dr. Arnold, in your opinion, within these 58 years, has the nation's development plans been Malaya-centric or equally fair across the nation? Have the special terms in MACC3 and subsequently as entrenched in the FC for Sabah and Sarawak been complied with accordingly? So maybe just those two first, Dr. Arnold. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I think when it comes to secession, it's a very popular subject here in Sabah and Sarawak. In fact, in my class, I would say 70 or 80% of my students would want to opt for secession from the federation. So when I probe them further why they want to secede, then most of them said that because they always compare Sabah Sarawak with Singapore, with Brunei. They say Singapore has developed so well. Brunei has one of the highest per capita income in the world. So they envision Sabah and Sarawak like Singapore and Brunei. So that's the reason, one of the primary reasons. So I think that the discussion is there. Now that the government has become more and more open, the positive thing about that is because there's more discussion about what needs to be done, basically, in order to make Sabah and Sarawak more autonomous in a sense, based on the Malaysian Agreement 1963 and based on the Federal Constitution. That's the good thing about that. because when you talk about autonomy, secession, you will not have to be fearful of being detained under ISA like before. But then again, that discussion has to be more structured, has to be more constructive, has to be more specific. We cannot afford to just talk about secession, just talk about Sabah and Sarawak rights because we want to raise the sentiment of the people. So I think this has been going on for a very long time. We have political leaders who have been talking about that issue over and over again, but when they are in the government, they seem to be incapable of addressing the issue. So I think it has to be seen in a constructive way. That is why, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, when we talk about MSCC3, what is it that we are basically referring to? What particular rights we want to be restored? Are we talking about the Intergovernmental Committee report, the recommendations that Sabah and Sarawak wanted before their inclusion into the federation? So I think this has to be done in a committee in which the members are experts, constitutional experts, not just politicians. Because if you don't do that, then I think we will just talking about history. We're just talking about rhetorics. We're not going to solve the problem about the imbalance in the economy, about the issue with regards to rights and so on and so forth. So I think the issue of secession is there, but it has to be directed to a way in which we can really solve the problem in the imbalance in federal and state relations. So the second question is, Ira, what was the second question?
Yeah, so the second question is, in your opinion, within these 58 years, has the nation's development plans been Malaya-centric or equally fair across the nation? Have the special terms in MA63 for Sabah and Sarawak been complied with? Yeah.
Well, we cannot deny the fact that it has been like that. It has been Malayan-centric or Malay-centric, I would say, because just look at our textbook, for instance. There's not much discussion on MSCC3, on Sabah and Sarawak, or on the contribution of Sabah and Sarawak leaders in the formation of Malaysia. So, but I think the government, the government has recognized this, and the government is trying to rectify this. I believe there's this committee to look into that, but we're not too sure about the progress of this committee. And I believe there's also a committee on MSCC3 formed by Tan Sri Muhyiddin before. So we hope that all these problems of dominance by the previous government, by the previous federal government, is to be addressed in the committee formed by the government. So, well, it has happened before, but I think now that we are beginning to see a realignment in our politics, so my hope is this will be rectified. So we're not talking about the dominance of any particular party or any particular race anymore, but we're talking about the real needs of Malaysian, especially those in Sabah and Sarawak and also in Peninsular Malaysia.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Arnold. There are a few other questions which I will save for a bit later because we'll go to, there's some questions for Adila actually. So for Adila, there are some questions here for you. Let me just try and read them out because there are a few. Okay, so the first one is, so it actually, you kind of explained this in your presentation, but maybe you can elaborate more, right? So how do we explain to youth the importance of the vote to their lives? Where should the training come from? You said that this is not happening in schools and your parents did not discuss politics. So I actually like the first part of this question, which is the importance of their vote in their lives, because I think this touches not just on young people, right? I think the sort of apathy to democratic institutions, to electoral systems is really gaining ground all around the world. And in many contexts, it is quite understandable because our democracies and our electoral systems have, to a certain extent, failed to represent the people's aspirations. So that's one for you, Adila. And then let me just see if there is, okay, so there's another one in the Q&A box from Azura from Nur Azura Saad. So her question is, how can I ensure that the representative I want to vote for will represent the Rakyat's voice, not their party's voice only? So not an easy question, that one. So Adila, over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Ira. I'm quite forgetful, so I might need to ask you again in case I forget anything.
No worries.
So the first one I believe was about, okay, education, and then where is it going to come from if it's not at school and it's not at home, and so where does it come from, right? Yeah, so when it comes to that, exactly, why isn't it in schools? Why isn't it being taught in schools? I believe that it should be something that's included as well, so that since children, they are given this, this exposure so that they're prepared, because when it comes to this, it needs to be trained, and children are ready for these types of conversations, like it or not, especially children nowadays. Information is at the tip of their fingers, and they're very much more advanced, little that we know. The reason why I'm saying that through my chest is really because I have younger siblings as well. And when I'm talking to my 14-year-old sister, I realize, oh, she knows much, much more than me when I was that age. And that's really because everything's so digitized and she's so used to it. She's a digital user. So information is at the tips of her fingers. Yeah. So that comes to that. If it's not in schools, then that's why I guess when civil society organizations come in, not unfortunately, but we come in when there's something that's missing, right? When the government's not doing something, that's when we come in. So that's another way. Maybe like, for instance, campaigns like Undi Sarawak, yeah, we can provide that. We could have initiatives towards that, but it would much better be, integrated. It goes inside our education system instead, because that's something, it's vital. It's part of your fundamental rights, and you want to know how to do it, teach it if it's important enough, right? I forgot already the second part of the question.
The second one is actually on how do we get our representatives to represent our voice and not their political party's voice?
That's a very interesting question. I need to be careful with what I say. That's one thing. So first of all, I asked the same question as well, actually, to my friend when it came to this. Okay, so what if there is like, okay, no one who's pushing for my issue, and I want someone who's actually representing it? So the formal way is really to write to them, formally write to them, maybe through email, through a letter. You have to go the extra mile kind of thing. But nowadays, I realize that sometimes people do go to Twitter. And if it gains enough traction, apparently they do reply and they do take note of what you say. So that's also another thing that you could consider. But when things do get really, really bad, when you realize that they're not listening at all, some do go to the extent of, exercising their rights to peaceful assembly. Or for instance, if you can see like Hartal Dr. Contract, that's something that they did as well. When they realize their voices are not being heard, they have to do something that would put the attention to them. And clearly it did. So there are certain ways that you can do about it. You could go the formal way, you could write to the MP Adun, try out Twitter as well, because everything's getting digitized nowadays, or you could try out something else. But of course, when it comes to dissent in that form, there's a lot that Malaysia needs to improve to ensure safety and so on and so forth. So back to Ira. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Adila. Yeah, I think really great answers, by the way. Don't worry, you did a great job. So thank you. Actually, there's a question here for Badrul, which I think is a rather interesting one. It's actually from Facebook, right? So in your earlier presentation, Badrul, you were talking about this need for decentralization in decision making in our democratic processes. So this person David Das actually asked, Badrul, who is the we who calls the we who are not politicians to call the shots? Yeah. You have to unmute dulu, Badrul.
We is the people. That's a simple question. That's a simple answer. And basically, as people who are not involved in politics, it doesn't mean that we are not involved in politics. Our involvement cannot be only once in 5 years where we actually go to vote. Our involvement is to be more, more involved. We had to include ourselves. We have to assert ourselves to be included in every single decision-making process that is being done by the authorities that affect us. And the problem with the centralized system is that it is further for us to be able to get involved, because there's no room to be involved locally. because sometimes all you need to do is just to deal with local issues. And we can just deal directly with our local council or our own neighborhood community members and all that. But even that, we don't have that space and we don't have that mechanism. So everything has to go through the top first and then they decide. And then, so MPs are even further for us to engage with when all they do is discuss national issues or national politics. So that's why the decentralization plays a really important role to allow us to be more involved in the day-to-day decision making of our own lives. Because this is not, we're not talking about big politics here, we're talking about our own life, whether we can cross a district or not, whether we can go out to make a living or not. That needs our input. It cannot be only by so-called expert who really don't know what we're dealing with. We need to tell them what we're dealing with. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Badrul. Okay, so there's a question in the Q&A box here, which it says here Sabah and Sarawak, but it's actually a lot wider than that. So I would actually like to hear maybe from Dr. Amrita first, and then the other speakers, if you would like to intervene. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee. So the first question there, we from Sabah and Sarawak always experience funny encounters when going to KL. Welcome to Malaysia. How did you get here? Or like even free postage all over Malaysia except Sabah and Sarawak. Confusing one with the other, etc. So the question is, after 58 years, it's saddening to know that Malaysians still do not know their Eastern counterparts well enough. So how can the federal government play a more proactive role in positively incorporating East Malaysia into the Malaysian narrative? Which route should be taken? History, education? Dr. Amrita, maybe? We haven't heard from you.
I can have a go.
Yes.
Look, I guess it's a multi-part answer in a way. Like, I mean, you know, you anonymous attendee, thank you for your question. You have already raised a couple of options. So one is, you know, history, another is education. So in general, yeah, you know, it is, you know, history textbooks, they are an opportunity to tell a certain kind of story about the nation. And right now the choice has been made to tell one type of story. And if Sabah and Sarawak are underrepresented in that story, then, you know, there is an opportunity to change it. History textbooks are a great example because they narrate the story of the nation, right? Education more broadly, sure, yes. I mean, I just basically completely agree with those two options. There's a couple of other things though as well. As we've mentioned a couple of times already in this webinar, you know, there is a moment now in which I guess there's an opportunity for Sabah and Sarawak to assert themselves. As Dr. Arnold was saying, you know, it's a particular kind of moment politically. And Adila, you made this point too, you know, like there's an opportunity for not only youth, but, you know, people from Sabah and Sarawak in general, you know, to come forward and kind of push their own narratives. And again, how the national government responds to that pushing or that assertion. You know, it's open, right? It has an opportunity. You know, is it going to be inclusive about how it does that, or would it prefer to attempt another wedge? You know, like the type that I have already discussed in terms of, you know, past wedges and how they've worked, and how they have quite deliberately, I guess, segmented and racialized groups of people and responded to them in different ways in order to maintain, you know, majorities and minorities and you know, have someone to point at and so on. So that's one way that they can respond. But as Badrul quite rightly said, in moments where there isn't a campaign, all that stuff falls away. You know, then we go back to national unity, right? So you have the campaign, it's very, you know, it can be very hostile and it can leave people feeling bruised, but ultimately always it drops away again because it's for the purpose of the campaign. And Malaysians are expected to know that. And Malaysians are expected to use the cushion of growth and development to be able to then go home and say to themselves, after all, I'm being delivered growth and I'm being delivered prosperity. And maybe I can put up with a bit of push and shove in terms of the race politics because, you know, I've got this cushion. Without the cushion there, that's, you know, that's an open question. You know, is it still going to work? And also, yeah, you know, without a kind of a dominant group and without a wedge kind of operating right now, is this a moment for people in Sabah and Sarawak to assert themselves? I mean, it seems like I don't really need to be the one to encourage them to. They're already doing so, and they're doing so all the time. right now, I've never heard so much discussion about Sabah and Sarawak really before. And I've been a Malaysian and watching Malaysia, for a long time. So, I think, yeah, in a way, it doesn't need me to say any more than that. It's already happening.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Amrita. So this leads us quite nicely, I think, to the next question for Dr. Arnold, actually. So there's a question from the same attendee. So the second question, local politics in Sabah and Sarawak, especially among youth, are sort of weak and borderline apathetic. This could be due to the large inequality gap in its societies, the political monopoly by certain families or sentiments, for example. How can we improve the situation on the ground? And another question underneath that by Roshan. Hi, Dr. Arnold. Would like to get your thoughts on the three territories, Sabah, Sarawak Peninsula. MA 63 seems to use state as the wording for Sabah and Sarawak. If you are to move forward recognizing Sabah and Sarawak as territories, would you see divisional level governance gain prominence in these two territories? If so, how would that look like? Dr. Arnold?
Well, I think how to encourage more young people to participate in politics. Well, we need to have people like Adila, more people like Adila, more NGOs, more civil society movements to basically create interest, especially among the young people, so that they will participate in politics more actively. When I say participate in politics more actively, I do not mean just by registering yourself as voters. Why not go to the political ring and contest? Because we don't have enough people in the political ring to contest in the election. And because Sabah and Sarawak's politics is very much personalistic. People on the ground in the rural area, they are following their leaders. You know that the figures in the political figures in Sabah, they've been there for a very, very long time. So it's time for us to see new faces in our political environment. People like Adila, I'm sure that there are many more under Undi Sarawak or Undi Sabah who are eager to go into the political ring. So I would encourage these people to go there. I wouldn't say to go and start a revolution like what Badrul said just now. You don't have to start a revolution. You just need to create the excitement. Get more young people to join politics. When you talk about politics to the young people, they think politics as something dirty. It's about corruption. It's about greed. It's about money. So it is not just about that. Politics is about governance. Politics is about policy making. Politics is about your future and my future. So this sort of idea has to be brought, has to be promoted to the young people, especially in the rural area. And I think you see some movements, not only in the social media, but already in the ground. I'm talking about Sabah. I'm not too sure about Sarawak, but I'm sure Adila and her group are doing something to create more awareness, especially among the young people. Yeah. So the second question, Era.
So the second question, I'll summarize it. So basically, if Sabah and Sarawak are recognized as territories instead of states, will divisional level governance then gain prominence? If so, how would that look like? Yeah.
Yeah, because if you look at the Malaysian Agreement 1963, I mean, a lot of people have different interpretation. So when they interpret states with capital S, they say that Sabah and Sarawak are basically, we're supposed to look at Sabah and Sarawak as regional governments, not as mere states or ordinary states, like the states in Peninsular Malaysia. I mean, even before the amendment in 1976, when you look at our constitution, they put Sabah, Sarawak in a different paragraphs. One paragraph is for the 11 states in the Peninsular Malaysia. The second one is for the Borneo Territory, Sabah and Sarawak, and the third one is for Singapore. So when they amended the constitution in 1976, Sabah and Sarawak were basically put in the same paragraphs with the other 11 states in Peninsular Malaysia. But then we must not forget, even though Sabah and Sarawak, they were put alongside the 11 states in Peninsular Malaysia, but if you look at the federal constitution clearly, Sabah and Sarawak still have more rights, more privileges compared to the states in Peninsular Malaysia. So when you want to return to that pre-1976 amendment, so you have to be very clear, you have to be very sure about what sort of equal partnership are we talking about here. So when you say equal partner, are we talking about the restructuring of our federation? Are we going to be a super federation? or are we going to be a confederation? So it is not just enough by just rearranging the wording in the federal constitution. So you have to give meaning to it. What is equal partnership? Because if you look at the, I only see equal partnership once, especially the Cobalt Commission report. I'm not too sure if there is any mention about equal partnership either in the federal constitution or in the intergovernmental report. So if we really want to go to the pre-1976 arrangement, then for me, it's important that we define clearly what equal partnership is and also the implication to our federal constitution.
Okay, thank you. Actually, Dr. Anil, I'm just going to direct just one more question at you since it's already here. So there's a question here from Shen Yong actually about the recent MOU, right? So the 3 initiatives underlined in the recent MOU between government and opposition. Will it institutionalize or focus the minds of MPs to more meaningful change for the Rakyat? Yeah, so basically what do you think of this latest MOU?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, it shows that we are capable of embracing the politics of inclusivity. We understand what political maturity is. I think it's a good sign. It's a good sign for the country that we are willing to talk things over. The politicians from the ruling government and the oppositions are willing to sit down and to talk about matters that are important for the country. So we set aside politics first. We talk about how we can address the country's economic issue, and also how do we strengthen the country's politics to ensure its stability in order to move forward within this context of COVID-19 pandemic. So I think for me personally, I look at it as a positive sign for the country. And I do agree with Badrul when he said that the government is not weak. I think the government is strong because no weak government can announce a state of emergency. And I read somewhere also saying that Malaysia is a failed state. We are not a failed state. A failed state is a state that cannot even give basic needs to the people. But in Malaysia, it's business as usual. The government is capable of giving this and that, you know. So we are not a failed state. Perhaps a lot of more failed politicians. That's what we need to address. Yeah, Malaysia, we have we have a bright future. We have a lot of resources in Sabah and Sarawak, but what we are lacking, we do not have statesmen, we do not have nation builders, or even good managers. But we have a lot of politicians, career politicians.
Thank you so much. I really like that. Perhaps the state. We don't have a failed state, but perhaps failed politicians, too many of them rather, right? So thank you so much, Dr. Arnold. So we have 10 more minutes. I actually have a question for Dr. Amrita, actually, just listening to your earlier presentation. And I would like to kind of, indulge myself in asking you, moderator's privilege and all that. I really was quite interested in what you said about the growth cushion, right? And where growth is going to come from. And it seems like you were alluding to, I don't know, either a shrinking pie or like, where are we going to sort of get growth from? And I thought that was really interesting because I feel like when in my reading about Malaysian politics, there's always this sort of 2 schools of thought, right? So the first one is that if everyone's comfortable, everyone gets a piece of the pie, everyone has an opportunity to grow social mobility and all that, then the identity part of politics will then be reduced, or people will not sort of have a reason to manifest their dissatisfaction in that way. There's another school of thought that says that says that's not true, right? Identity, race, religion will always be at the forefront, no matter how big the pie is or no matter how much opportunity people get. I actually spoke to an Adun recently, and he gave a very interesting analogy. So he said, previously, when we tell people, when we provide bread and butter for the people, they will be happy, and people won't be so divided anymore. But nowadays, when you give bread and butter, people will ask, is the bread halal or not? right? Which I thought was a pretty interesting analogy. So I would actually like to get your thoughts on this, because I think it's such a fundamental question to answer. Yeah.
And again, it's a super tough question to answer, but in a way, the history of the Malaysian nation is like a history of an experiment, right? With this question. So the view of successive governments, as I mentioned earlier, has always been that growth and social cohesion, they just go hand in hand. There's no getting around it. That ultimately, the growing pie is going to deliver bigger slices to everyone. And the NEP did that. It delivered bigger slices to everyone. It produced a middle class across the board. And then within that growing pie, there were also bigger slices for certain groups for specific historical reasons, which, I don't really have a big problem with, to be honest with you. So now without that growth, it's like, people actually not just in Malaysia, but around the world too, and you could argue very similar things about Australia as well. Without those opportunities, where does that leave the question of identity? Like, is it just going to solve itself because people are mature, or is it going to, is it forever linked to growth? And without that growth, is there going to be some kind of massive crisis now over identity? And the answer is, I have no idea, because I don't think we've been in this position in the Malaysian nation state before, right? So now we're going to watch and observe, I guess. One, is it possible to generate growth at those same rates that people have been used to? Two, if the regional order is changing so that the great powers are not just white former colonizer powers, but are in fact, China, or include China, does that change the game then in terms of who you can blame? In terms of who you can point to as a scapegoat? Does it make it more complicated to always have, Chinese as people that you can point to? I don't know the answer, right? And like I said, in 2018 actually demonstrated that Malaysians are capable of separating Malaysian Chinese from PRC Chinese. It is very, very easy for Malaysians to do that because they are citizens of the region, right? They understand the differences. But, if the growth is tied to China's rise, is that growth then going to reproduce the developmentalist moment, or from the 70s to now? Or is it going to be less? Is it not going to be enough to go round? Is it going to be so actively pushed back against by coalitions of nations like the US, UK, Australia? You would have all seen that security agreement that was just announced yesterday. With that pushback, does that make it more complicated too? And if that pushing back is taking place, are these other powers going to come in and say, okay, now we're going to underwrite your growth? I don't know, right? I don't know where it's all going to go. So that leaves multiple open questions in this non-answer that I'm giving you. One is it true that you must have growth to have social cohesion? And two, where's the growth going to come from? And if the growth is no longer tied to a white regional order, how does identity politics in Malaysia have to change? Beats me. We're going to find out.
Thank you so much. It wasn't a non-answer. I think it was very informative, especially trying to think about because Malaysia's by no means the only place in which these contestations are happening, right? It is a global trend, and Malaysia is caught up in that wave. Definitely, we have different dynamics, of course, in Malaysia, but I think this contestation is something to really look out for, and and it brings to question all these sort of fundamental things about our democracy, economic growth, and all that. Okay, so 5 more minutes, but there's another question actually here for Badrul. So, okay, how do we overcome potential, this is from Facebook, yeah? How do we overcome potential communal violence in highly pressured urban settings? What is the role of government, civil society, and business to build harmonious race relations? So I think the question is more on the first part about, urban settings and communal violence, Badrul.
Okay, there's no easy answer for that. Basically, we have to accept that we will always be, like I said earlier, at each other's faces in the urban setting. So we have to be able to ourselves learn how to coexist with others. There's not enough regulation, there's not enough government effort that can help us do this. We need to do it ourselves. We need to understand that a violent incident affects everybody. When KL experienced the May 13th riot, I mean, I wasn't there, but it affected the entire city, even people who weren't involved in the violent act. So we need to understand that. We need to be able to learn how to sort of de-escalate any tensions that are brewing within our communities. Meaning we need to always be able to gauge how our neighbors are feeling. I'm not saying that we always have to be good neighbors. We always have to, like, jaga tepi kain, if what, Malays always like to say that. But there is a skill that we need to learn, just like how we travel in places that we don't know. We need to be able to know when situation is getting difficult, when the situation is getting more dangerous, and we need to be able to de-escalate that. And there's a lot of ways to learn how to do this. Public health practitioners teach this. Even as we grow up and dealing with other people, this is, being cordial, being civil, all these are small elements that if we actually do practice it and we actually learn from it, we can manage our community ourselves without the need of a strong hand. At the same time, we do need, there is a role of a government to protect. There is a role of government to provide security whenever things get out of hand. But it's always better for us to be able to make sure that things don't get out of hand first before, strong power come and intervene, because it's always bad. I hope I answered this question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Badrul. Thank you. I think we don't have much time left, but I would actually like to perhaps just close with Adila, our youngest panelist today. Just a question from me, actually. So, I'll keep it short, which is one thing I often read about in social media is that Undi 18 / the sort of sister organizations like Undi Sarawak and Undi Sabah are too urban centric, too focused on English speaking, an English speaking audience. So maybe you can share with us, very shortly about how Undi Sarawak is trying to counter that kind of narrative and reaching out actually to those who matter most. Yeah. So please, Adila.
Right. Thank you. I'll just keep it really short because I know it's already 5 o'clock. But when basically one of the things really that we're really trying to push out is when it comes to the content, we really, I'm so scared all the time right now. But it's basically
don't worry. I'm the moderator and I'm saying you can go ahead. So
it's putting them into those different languages. It takes time, really, because first we have the English version, and then after that, someone goes in and okay, we'll do the Sarawakian Malay. Okay, is this correct? And then we go ask back our parents even, is this the proper one? Is this the best way to say it in Sarawakian Malay? And that's another thing. And then after that, we do it in Iban. So that's one of the ways that we want to make sure that it's not just English centric, because we understand that we can hear that as well. And then when it comes to having, our initiatives and we have events, kita pakai bahasa Sarawak, kita pakai bahasa Sarawak, that's how you would sound like if I was in Sarawak. And then we use all these, Sarawakian identities as well. For instance, when we have Desi, Tare, and all that. So those are one of the ways to make sure that it's not focused kepada urban centric. It's not just English. It's trying to make other people feel included because you are part of this as well. So that's one of the ways. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Adila. Okay, so it's 5:01, so I will have to end our webinar today. So thank you very much again to our Tunku Abidin at the beginning, His Excellency Mikhalis Rokas, and then of course our 4 excellent panelists who have, I think, provided such an interesting, very different but also very interesting viewpoints, for our webinar Narratives of Nationhood today. After this, or maybe it already is up, but don't forget to tune in into Ideas social media channels, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, to tune into our third Sama-Sama conversation video as part of our larger national unity campaign. You can tune in right now. I believe the links are already up. Helmi, if you don't, if it's okay, I don't know if it's up, but if it's already up, my colleagues who are in the call, please do share it in the chat box. And if it's not, you can go view it after this. So thank you so much for spending your Friday evening with us. A storm has descended where I am at the moment. And it's been a really great privilege to be able to moderate our discussion for today. So thank you very much again to everyone. And Assalamualaikum. And have a good weekend, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Ira.
Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Badrul,
Thank you,
Fadila,
everyone. Yep, thank you.
Amitra.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. See
Thank you,
you.
Rata.
Bye.